And Kurt, we're good to go.
Good morning, good afternoon, and in a very few cases, as I saw, also good evening. Welcome to our series on green finance and climate policies in Canada and Europe. So this is our second webinar, and this one will deal with the question, what regulatory regimes, if at all, can accomplish? And I think so, this is not only a kind of academic question, but actually a very politically relevant question for at least three reasons I would like to mention at the very beginning. First, green finance is only a small fraction of the overall global financial industry. And in order to really make it a strong force in supporting the transition towards net zero carbon emission economies, I think so it needs to grow. Number two, the hopes from the Glasgow summit that the financial industry and would really support and in a strong way green investments, those hopes have faded a bit for a variety of reasons. Third, those regulatory approaches that have been introduced and used over the last couple of years have moved into very, let us say, stormy weathers. So there is quite some pushback in particularly in the US, but also in other parts of the world. So all this leads me to the conclusion that all those approaches of, let us say, self-regulation didn't go very far. So it needs probably a regulatory push from governments. The question is, so what kind of regulatory approaches are really adequate and what they actually can accomplish? So this will be the kind of the big kind of umbrella topic of our seminar today. This whole series is made possible due to a grant of the German Foreign Office via the German Embassy in Canada. So thanks so much. Without this help, we wouldn't be sitting here on the screen and to have the chance to talk about this. So what we are doing today is we will have a roundtable conversation, but before we do this, we'll have some opening remarks by the German ambassador to Canada, Sabine Sparwasser. She has been the ambassador since August 2017, so she's now in a 5-year period in Canada. Hopefully this doesn't mean that you're leaving pretty soon. Before that, she was the German government special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. But also, she has a long kind of relation with Canada. She was actually the Consul General in Toronto in the 2010s, I think so. She studied German, French, and English literature and linguistics in Mainz. Then she did a postgraduate studies in political science at Sciences Po in Paris. And she held also in the past a chair at the University of Paris, Vincennes. So she's well-rounded, political science, arts, covering a lot of things. And without further ado, Ambassador Sparwasser, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Hübner, and welcome to this webinar on sustainable financing. I think looking at it from a political point of view, this is one of the most hopeful developments in the last few years. Green financing has become the commercially smart thing to do. The dialogue has really shifted, I find, from viewing climate change only in terms of risk to seeing it in terms of opportunity and to translate it into an objective, which is move our economies to net zero as quickly as possible. Big finance and money talks. And today also people, simple, normal people like us vote with their bank accounts and investments. So the big finance actors like pension funds and asset managers have to prove where they are in their transition to net zero. And actually this was a big subject during the visit of Chancellor Scholz to Canada. He met with the pension funds and they talked about transitioning their portfolios to net zero. The good news is, so this transition of finance neither follows ideology nor follows generosity. It is straight capitalist reasoning behind it. If investors want to continue to make profit and grow on this planet, there needs to be a planet. So a quick look, Professor Hübner has mentioned it. Where are we now? The COP26 in Glasgow created high hopes for green financing. COP27 in Sharm El-Sheikh, less so. It inserted a note of skepticism. How to avoid greenwashing or green hushing, and what needs to be the measure stick to declare bonds and investments as green. Well, I know it's complicated, and you've introduced that it is a complicated subject. We need to answer questions like, can we allow companies to invest at the same time in greening our economies and in new fossil fuel assets and still claim to be net zero? Is the best the enemy of the good? Do we feel like accepting that it's better to replace investment into gas and taking it out of coal for the net zero future? So standards need to be worked out, and they're very, very much thought about. The EU is not a superpower on anything, but the EU is a superpower when it comes to developing standards. And it has done a lot of work on sustainability reporting to support and to steer companies. But we know, all of us, we need more expertise. We need more international push to move these standards ahead. As in nearly everything else, Canada and Germany are very closely aligned. So we look forward to listening to all these brilliant experts' advice and ideas today, experts from the EU, from Canada, and from Germany, and hear their perspective. A special thank you again to Professor Hübner for taking us into discussions and conversations on subjects that will be so determining for our future. Thank you and good luck with the webinar.
Thanks so much, Ambassador Sparwasser. This is really encouraging words and also encouraging for our roundtable, I think so. Now you have to deliver the right kind of answers to all those critical questions. So let me start saying for all the participants, our audience, if you have questions, interventions, please use the chat so then we can answer and the questions you have and reply to all your interventions. Now, the next thing is our roundtable. And what I'm doing now is introducing our 5 speakers. I do it in a kind of alphabetical order. And I start therefore with Lucia Alessi. She's the team leader at a joint research center of the European Commission in Milano. Before she took this kind of position, she was working at a European Central Bank where she served in various departments, including research, economics, and macro-prudential policy and financial stability. She's very much, her work is very much focusing on climate risk in equity markets, so pretty much at the core what we are doing. She published across the board. She holds a PhD in economics and management from St. Anna School for Advanced Studies and a degree from economics from Bocconi University. So that's the short version for Lucia. Then we move to Nikolai. Nikolai Badenhoff is a legal scholar who focuses on sustainable finance. He holds a law degree from Humboldt University in Berlin, from Sapienza University of Rome, and King's College in London. He, as I mentioned, his PhD is from the Humboldt University, and I think so he's based on his dissertation. He published a book exploring EU banking regulation and its impact on private national law. He was until recently at the European University Institute in Florence, and now is at the Leibniz Institute in Frankfurt, exactly dealing with the core or topic of today. Then Annika Kochu is a senior advisor at a Berlin-based consultancy with the name Adelphi. Adelphi actually was very helpful in preparing and giving me some insights for our seminars. She has more than 7 years experience in green finance and all kinds of adaptation policies in regards to climate policy. She provides sustainability related advisory and capacity building for financial institutions from the European Union and also for emerging economies, something that has been covered in Egypt only recently. Her focus is on risk assessment, climate strategy development, ESG disclosures, and all those kind of elements that are, again, at the core of our seminar today. Then we have Sebastian Mack. He is a policy fellow for European financial markets at the Jacques Delors Center at the Hertie School, also in Berlin. His research focuses on European banking supervision, capital market unions, and financial crime, something we hopefully don't cover today, but still an interesting topic. Before he took his position at the Jacques Delors Center, he worked as an academic assistant and policy advisor to a German member of the European Parliament's Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee, and as an audit senior for Prudential regulation at an international leading accounting firm. So that's Sebastian. And then we have Marla Orenstein. She is the director of the Natural Resource Center of the Canada West Foundation here in Canada. Much of her work focuses on Canada's energy future and how Canadian businesses can prosper as the world transitions to cleaner forms of energy. She worked quite a lot in her past with industry and communities on the impact of energy and resource development projects, including electricity, mining, solar, wind, hydro, and oil and gas. So as you may know, if you know where the Canada West Foundation is located, then it's in a one critical province in Canada, in Alberta. And I think so that's really a background because that's the core of the fossil fuel industry in Canada. So she has all those insights how to deal with those industry actors in order to support a cleaner future. So that's our panel of today. And I think so you already get a kind of impression. This makes me more or less redundant because they're all those experts. They know much more than I know. And hopefully they will provide us with a very stimulating discussion. Now, as Ambassador Spavas already mentioned, I think so it was only recently before the summit in Egypt that a high-level expert group under the leadership of the former Canada's Environmental Minister, Catherine McKenna, stated in this report that companies could not claim to be net zero while they continue to build or invest in new fossil fuel assets, and decarbonization plans must not support new coal, oil, and gas supplies. That's really a kind of citation of this report. So that's a pretty bold statement. And so, you know, one can make the argument a transition to a net zero carbon emission economy not only needs the right kind of political will on the side of governments, it also needs, obviously, funding. And this is the role where green finance in general can be very, very critical. We also know, at least from the last meltdown of the cryptocurrency industry, for example, that those markets, financial markets, need also some kind of proper regulation. And the questions for me is a bit, you know, why is it that private companies, the private business sectors at all, is a bit hesitant when it comes to complying with even the very, let's say, self-regulation rules? What is the experience in Canada? How are the private business sector acting with those regulatory criteria, efforts, and so on? And let's start with Marla. What is your insight for the Canadian situation?
You know, Kurt, you brought up so many questions, as has the ambassador, that are really good, tough questions, which is why I think we're here talking today is we have this lovely goal in our heads for all of us, but how we get there is actually really, really messy. What I'm pleased to be able to say is that within Canada, there's been strong and rapid movement around ESG and sustainability. Certainly, if we look at, rather than look at the performance right now, I'm just going to talk about disclosure, because that's something that we have better metrics on, is companies that disclose. Like many countries, almost all of the companies that list on the major stock exchanges. So in Calgary, in Canada, that would be the Toronto Stock Exchange. Last I saw, it was something like 91 or 96% of companies that were listing are actually disclosing their ESG performance. And that data was a couple of years old, a couple of years behind. So I would not be surprised if it were closer to, let's say, 97 or 98%. That's really helpful. For ourselves, we took a deep dive into the energy sector, and we wanted to say, well, what's going on with the energy sector itself? And so we reviewed ESG disclosure from a number of different kinds of energy companies. And energy isn't all one thing. So we broke it down into oil and gas, into wind and solar, into electric utilities, and into pipeline operators. What we found is that there was actually huge variance between these different groups in how the extent to which they're putting together and putting out publicly ESG or sustainability reports. If we look at the largest oil and gas producers, the top producers, like the top 25 or 30, 100% of them, 100% were, they understood, and they were putting together, and they were putting the effort into the ESG disclosure. But when we looked at the smaller producers, and again, this data is a couple years old because it does lag, it was only 20%. So there was a vast difference between the large companies and the small companies. I'll circle back to that in a minute. If we looked at the wind and solar companies, it was only about a third of them putting out any sort of ESG disclosure or sustainability disclosure. Electric utilities were much higher, about 3/4 of them. Pipeline operators, it was more like 40%. We looked across a number of different factors to see what was it that might be driving the differences. Part of it is the size of the company. If you're a larger company, you have more resources to be able to put into actually putting this information out there and gathering all the data that you need. So the size of the company certainly played a factor. Whether it was public or private played another large factor. We found that certainly the public companies that were concerned about getting the green finance dollars in terms of investment were much more likely to be disclosing. The ones that were private companies were really much more on the fence. They weren't certain whether it was better in the end for them to be spending the resources disclosing their practices, or actually spend that same time and effort doing better for things like the host community. So they weren't sure, should they be actually spending the time improving their sustainability performance or talking about their sustainability performance. And a lot of them seem to go we want to perform route. Similarly, the ownership structure of the company, in addition to private or public, some of these companies are owned by municipalities, for example, and those would be much more likely to disclose. So we saw a real split in terms of what they were doing. There was also a real split and a lot of messiness in terms of their familiarity of what to do. Although the frameworks, and we're going to be talking about this today, are continuing to evolve and continuing to provide more clarity on how to disclose, there was really not a great deal of consistency across those who did disclose. Almost everybody reported on greenhouse gas emissions, but almost nobody reported on waste, for example, which is a metric that the frameworks say you should be reporting on. In the realm of social things, almost everybody reported on health and safety, but very few people had any sort of strong reporting on Indigenous rights and relationships. And similarly in governance, tons of people reporting on stakeholder engagement, but very few on supply chain management. So there wasn't necessarily consistent, strong, evidence-based disclosure, even if there was a report that was put out there. So what we took away from this is that often the intention is there, but there's a bit of a learning curve going on among these companies as to what it is that they should be doing and what information is important, and how to balance that against the actual action of being sustainable. Another point was that frameworks can be helpful, but they don't solve all the problems from a company disclosure perspective, because many of the frameworks are silent on a number of really important issues. And for Canada, one of those issues is Indigenous rights reconciliation and relationships. The evolving standards like the new ISSB don't go into what is it that should be disclosed, and we have very particular ways that this raises itself in importance in Canada. So there's probably going to need to be some supplementary frameworks or supplementary guidance for companies, showing them a path forward as to what good looks like in terms of those topics that are specific to Canada. And the companies are finally still thinking about the why of why they're doing this. If they need to attract capital, okay, that makes sense for them to disclose. But if they don't, they often prefer to spend their time actually doing the things that create sustainability for the host communities, for example, rather than just talking about it. So those were some of the lessons that we came away with. It's messy, it's evolving, there's intention, but even with the increasing standardization of frameworks, it's not solving all the problems at this point.
So if I take this then in other words, so a lot of those criteria and let us say regulatory efforts are a bit opaque. Mm-hmm. So they allow a lot of, let us say, interpretation. So what is the situation in Europe, Annika? Is there a kind of similar development? How are companies, the private sector complying? What are the kind of the ways of interaction between regulations, criteria, and the private business sector?
Thank you, Kurt. Right, so I can mostly report on the EU taxonomy and how this is being used for public disclosure. At Adelphi, in the finance team, I'm a senior advisor in Adelphi's finance team, and we have been conducting several projects on the EU taxonomy. So for example, we provide technical assistance to banks and funds on how to actually operationalize the EU taxonomy, and we also work on developing policy recommendations on how to improve. Since I'm the first expert today to speak about the taxonomy, I would like to give a quick introduction. I think it's one of the key instruments for sustainable disclosure at the moment. It's only starting to apply, but it's definitely stirred up the market a lot. So it's basically a list of sustainable activities that contribute to the EU's environmental objectives. It's currently available for 2 goals, namely climate change mitigation and adaptation, but four additional environmental objectives will follow, as will a taxonomy for social sustainability. It defines a list of activities that are compliant with a climate neutral and environmentally sustainable future, but it also lists transitional activities for hard to abate sectors and enabling activities that help others become more sustainable. And how does it work? It basically defines a couple of substantial contribution criteria that are proof of the positive effect of an activity, but it also includes do no significant harm criteria that show that the good that we're doing doesn't do bad to another objective. And it also contains a couple of minimum social standards, which make sure that like labor rights, etc., aren't harmed by these types of sustainable activities. Its use is mandatory in disclosure. So from 2022, non-financial companies, large non-financial companies, will have to report the share of taxonomy-aligned revenues and investments on an entity level. And the same will apply for financial institutions from 2024. This will have to be done using predefined key performance indicators and templates. On the level of individual financial products, detailed disclosures are also required by the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, and the taxonomy cases for that are not. And how does this create impact? Through this additional information that's going to be on the market, investors will be able to select sustainable assets, ask critical questions, engage with investees and clients, set targets, etc. And this is how the EU is hoping to increase sustainable finance. And well, how does this all work out? So we've conducted a couple of surveys on how the taxonomy is being applied, what are challenges, and we've also, like I said before, worked with financial institutions in operationalizing the taxonomy. Obviously, there are challenges and solutions, like costs and benefits, so good things and bad things about the taxonomy. There was a lot of talk about challenges, but since it's only just starting to apply, the next years will be crucial for showing how relevant the tool actually is. Several core challenges that we note in our discussions with financial institutions are obviously the lack of data. Like, for example, if a financial institution wants to report on their taxonomy alignment, it needs data from its clients or investees, and this data is currently still lacking or very, very unreliable in its quality. Another challenge is the complexity of the taxonomy. Some criteria are quite hard to interpret, or very complex, especially for smaller FIs who like stuff. And there are a couple of controversies around the activities that are included in the taxonomy. But these are challenges that can all be addressed through a couple of, or that will basically be addressed in the upcoming years, I think. I can definitely go into much more detail on what potential solutions would be if you'd like me to later on. Overall, I think the taxonomy has really stirred up the financial sector, but it's also stirred up the real economy, which I think is a great result because it's a financial sector tool, financial sector, but it's really creating change and awareness in the real economy, as we call it in Germany. So I think this is definitely basically a promising development. And yeah, so but of course, it's a new tool, it's complex, and whether or not it will be used in the future is currently still outstanding. So I think there will have to be a lot more work and guidance around it to make it a useful tool.
Thank you. There's immediate intervention from Sebastian, and then we move along. Sebastian, please.
Well, thank you much. Well, Kurt asked us to have a lively debate and to react a bit and not just present our own research. So I take the liberty to directly intervene. And first of all, thanks Kurt and the whole University of British Columbia for inviting me. I'm fascinating of this round of distinguished experts and to have the opportunity to exchange views with you. So to understand, my work is very policy oriented, I have to admit. So I rarely produce own surveys or reports, but I use the research work of others, like, for example, the one produced by Annika and her colleagues at Adelphi. And first of all, I would like to congratulate you to all the work you're doing. In particular, if I may say, for the last survey that you just presented. If I may just add to the issue of the taxonomy, I think I fully agree with what you said. There's a lack of reliable taxonomy data, limited sector scope, and so on. But I think the other problem of the taxonomy is that it makes a 0-1 decision. So either an activity makes a significant contribution to the environment, then it is green, or not. So this omits entirely the big financing needs of activities that help transform the economy towards green. And I therefore would strongly advise, in line, by the way, with the Commission's own expert group, to soon come up with a proposal for a so-called amber category with activities that we need to get to dark green.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And it's also one of our main findings is the fact that taxonomy compliant activities are actually very, like this, the taxonomy compliant activities in the investment horizon is very, very low, which is basically a good thing if we consider this to be an ambitious tool, but also keeps lots of investors and bankers from actually, it keeps the use of the tool quite small for steering portfolios, because sustainable finance demand is large and investors want to really invest into sustainability and they need to move large amounts of money. And if the taxonomy applies only to a very small share of the market, then it's not currently super useful for investors with large amounts of money, which is a good thing and a bad thing because it shows that actual sustainability is too low. that the real economy has to shift towards greater sustainability.
Yeah, I mean, this allows me now to summarize or to make in a nutshell argument. I mean, green finance and regulation, as far as I understand, should punish brown and black investments and should favor green investments. So if this is the kind of benchmark, where are we? And Lucia, you are very in the forefront also with the European Union in working out the design. So maybe you can share your experience, how a regulatory approach of the EU, how it comes forward, and whether it really meets the high standards.
Thank you, Kurt. So just a little caveat, as you said, I work at the European Commission. So if being the title of the panel, our regulatory approach is the right thing, I might be a bit biased. A
bit? Okay.
So yeah, I mean, they might not be, of course, sufficient, but we believe they are needed, at least to some extent. And in fact, what we see from the industry is that it is investors asking for more transparency, it is investors asking for clear definitions, it is investors asking for tools. For example, in Europe, we are developing the EU Green Bond Standard, which is a green bond standard whereby the green bonds that are issued under this standard provide a guarantee to the investor that all the bond proceeds will be used to finance taxonomy aligned activities, 100% taxonomy aligned activities. While you know that at the moment, green bonds the vast majority of them are not certified. So we just need to trust the issuer that this money will be used for green activities. For those that are certified, there are several different certification schemes, climate bond initiatives, ICMA, and they differ to some extent in their definition. So this tool that the European Commission is working on aims at bringing even more transparency. We have other tools that we are working on, for example, the eco-label for financial products. Again, it is another tool that builds on the taxonomy and will be applied to essentially investment funds, but also some deposit products and insurance products. And essentially only the very top environmentally performing financial products will be awarded the eco-label, also based on the share of investments that they devote to taxonomy-aligned activities, together with other criteria. So, I mean, in terms of regulatory frameworks, we are doing a lot of work building on the cornerstone of the whole framework, which is the EU taxonomy. And by the way, as it was already mentioned, there is this proposal to extend the green taxonomy to also an amber taxonomy, which would be facilitating the transition probably even more. Now, coming to your question, punishing brown investments versus incentivizing green investments. There is a discussion at the moment on the regulatory front, which pertains more macroprudential policy. So bank capital requirement. One alternative is the so-called green supporting factor, which is something that the Commission wanted to investigate, at least in its first action plan that was published in 2018. And indeed, the idea was to support green investments made by banks by requiring lower capital requirements associated to those assets. At the other end of the spectrum, there is the so-called brown penalizing factor, which means requiring banks to hold a larger capital in association with assets that are financing actually polluting activities. And well, the state of the art at the moment, and we also have done research on that, is that in fact, from a purely risk perspective, there is for sure scientific evidence in favor of a so-called brown penalizing factor, because what we show is essentially that if the market would decide at some point to de-invest from brown sectors, from brown activities, there could be repercussions in capital markets whereby the price of these assets, these polluting assets, would fall. And what we show in a JRC working paper is that even a super small decrease in the price of these assets in the order of 0.3% could cause some bank defaults, because there are some banks in Europe that are so exposed to these particular sectors that they could risk bankruptcy. And if that would then trigger panic on the market and further depreciations and further bank defaults, this could spiral up to a true banking crisis. So what we show essentially is that there are good reasons for thinking about introducing additional capital buffers to protect the financial system from this risk. Thank you.
Yeah, this is a very good point, but I would like to come back. In our first webinar, Caroline Flemmer gave our kind of keynote presentation based on an empirical study she did. And she showed that, let us say, certified green bonds come up with a positive premium rate of return, now one end with relatively positive climate policy effects. So you mentioned also certified and non-certified green bonds. So how can we make it happen that the non-certified green bonds are getting certified? So that this is also probably the area where a lot of greenwashing is happening. So if you could talk a bit about how to minimize the non-certified green bonds and to maximize the certified green bonds, because obviously that's the better tool than the other one. So this tells me there's a lot of, let us say, misallocation also in the financial market, that those two kind of versions of green bonds are existing at the same time.
I mean, my belief is that this will happen naturally. We have a JRC working paper where my colleagues show that a negative greenium, so a significantly lower cost of capital, is mainly attached to those green bonds that are third-party verified, first, that are issued by repeated issuers, so again, credibility. And also they show in another paper that in fact, green bonds are a good signal towards a commitment towards decarbonization. So of course we cannot establish a causal link, but there is a positive association. So if these are if things are like this, then of course issuers have a good incentive to certify their bonds, because they can fund themselves at a lower cost.
Okay, and Nikolai, I would like to ask you the question. The European Union is very famous for a kind of global rule setter in many areas. So will the taxonomy and everything that is coming around with it, is there a chance to make it to a kind of global gold standard?
Thanks for the question, Kurt. I think the EU taxonomy is a great example of standard setting by the EU that might very well have a global impact. And here we have also the link to the EU green bond standard that Lucia just told us about, which I did conduct a survey, sorry, not a survey, a study for the European Parliament, especially the Econ Committee, during this ongoing legislative process, which is on green bonds, an assessment of the EU green bond standard and its potential to prevent greenwashing. So here we are actually at a very crucial point. Non-certified bonds, green bonds, do not have that impact, as Caroline Flemmer showed us and other research showed us too. And so the issue is really to get those assets and to get those bonds moving towards certification and to have clarity, to have clearer regulation, harmonization of standards that will help investors and companies alike that issue green bonds to come up with credible solutions that in the end help climate change prevention. And so certification is key. And I think for the green bond standard, we will see whether it will remain a merely voluntary standard or whether it gets some mandatory impulse. Because as of the trilogues that I recently followed, the European Parliament included in its position that there is a minimum mandatory disclosure requirement for any bond that is pretends to sustain economic activities that are meant to be environmentally sustainable. So anything labeled as green would then have to fulfill a minimum requirements, which would lead to basically a requirement of getting certified if you want to be part of that group. And this would steer the markets towards certification. And basically, this is something that I delved into in my study, looking at different scenarios of mandatoriness or voluntariness options. You have basically four. So either it's entirely voluntary, or it's voluntary mandatory, so with minimum standards, minimum requirements, or it's mandatory to disclose green or non-green, or it is mandatory greenness option. The last two are politically not on the table, but if we look at the first two, actually option 2 is very interesting as of the mandatory voluntary version that would require to those bonds that are issued as green and labeled as such without providing any clear information on why they are so, to basically follow those minimum standards and minimum requirements. So this is one of the impact the European Union can have, but this is just regarding the fixed income asset of a green bond. And this is just one level. And here I would like to go back to your question and the broadest landscape we're talking about. So we are having disclosure as a key element in capital markets for sustainable finance products. We want to understand why a financial product is supposed to be environmentally sustainable or socially sustainable. So disclosure really is key, which is why the taxonomy is helpful, but also the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation at EU level is very helpful. And this is just part of a network, because we also have the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive for general capital market information regarding sustainability factors. And we also have the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive regarding supply chains. So this is actually a whole network of sustainable finance law at the EU level. And this, of course, is embedded in a more international landscape and in more international discussion, where we have different private, but also non-private, so public international standard setters trying to come up with solutions with the Financial Stability Board, trying with the Task Force on Climate Action, but also the Glasgow Finance and Net Zero Alliance. We have this International Sustainability Standard Board. So it will be interesting in the end to see which of these standards can actually compete best, and whether the EU, with this very, very solid and very thorough framework of the EU taxonomy, and also all the other legislative components that I just mentioned around it, will have a global impact and also reach that amount of attention that will then get the whole track towards better disclosure and meaningful disclosure.
Marla, would this be something that you could recommend that Canada would adapt the European approach, and even with a stronger kind of mandatory kind of element? There
has been a group working on a Canadian version of the taxonomy, and it's been in place for years. I see Lucia is nodding her head, and she may have some more information on it. I've been watching for them to come out with the taxonomy. I've been watching for more than 2 or 3 years as it's failed to come out. I'm not sure what it is that's hanging up. But when Nikolai was talking, a question was coming to my mind that I'm curious to address to Annika if I can. It just has to do with the taxonomy. one of the things that we're seeing is some of the perverse and unintended consequences that are happening in Canada in the energy sector. And I'm wondering how the taxonomy deals with this or is intended to deal with this, which is companies that want to be responsible in the energy sector. Let's say it's an oil and gas company that's trying to move to net zero, taking certain of their assets and selling them off because they are lower performing in certain areas. And those who buy them don't have the same eye on performance. So the asset remains.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of being managed by somebody who is more responsible because it makes them look worse, it's now being managed by somebody much, much less responsible who really doesn't care. And in terms of an investment perspective, okay, now you can invest in this better company and you'll get your money back. But when we look at it broadly in terms of global impact, I'm not sure that we've had the positive effect that we want. We may have actually had the opposite of that. Is that something that the taxonomy takes into consideration, and how?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is definitely one of the major problems. So the bad moving from the public to the, more or less, from where it was being watched before to where it's no longer under control more. And I would say, I'm also passing the question on to Lucia maybe later on. I would say it's currently not something that the taxonomy is addressing. So the taxonomy basically allows the company to report on the good that they do, but it doesn't have a mechanism that basically requires the company on the basically. It doesn't have any provisions that would require it to report on, selling off the non-aligned activities, for example, or investments and assets. So I think this is definitely something that needs to be addressed. And it basically boils down to the question of making undesirable things economically unattractive, I would say, because in the end, the economically attractive will always find a financier. Yeah.
Lucia, anything to add?
Well, I think we should clarify that, yes, indeed, I mean, the taxonomy only mandates to disclose about the taxonomy alignment of a business, not about the polluting share of the business. But after all, and so, I mean, what is not aligned can be very polluting, or it can also be irrelevant. So if we are looking at the very polluting activities, in fact, Annika is fully right, there is no obligation to disclose about that share of the business. And that, again, refers back to what was mentioned again by another panelist, that so far we do not have an amber taxonomy or even a red taxonomy. So, I mean, that's the situation. However, what I think I would like to say is that probably what we are already seeing is that investors and companies are actually striving to increase that share of taxonomy alignment of theirs. So the idea is that probably they will most likely invest into something that increases their level of taxonomy alignment rather than into something that does not. So the hope is that this virtuous cycle would be triggered at some point.
Sebastian, you raised your hand time ago, and I only want to mention in a paper Sebastian produced, I think so, a year ago or so, on the taxonomy. You were also making the argument that maybe the taxonomy is too detailed, and it should go more for kind of principles, so that a different kind of regulatory thinking and approach. But please go ahead.
Yeah, perhaps. Thank you very much, Kurt. As a quick reaction to what Lucia just said, I think if it is really the case that companies and particular financial firms are now moving forward in compliance with the taxonomy, I think that would really be a positive step. However, unfortunately, we have a lot of at least anecdotal evidence of greenwashing so far. And the anecdotes, I have to admit, are getting really big stories now. So as this is a Canadian-German panel we are having here, just wanted to share what I read just last week in the German newspaper Handelsblatt that some in this call might be familiar with. And they reported about a research project that they where they evaluated more than, I looked it up here, 800 investment funds that are traded in Europe and that call themselves Article 9 funds, so so-called dark green funds. They all signed to the strictest regulations, and in principle are only allowed to make climate-friendly investments. However, the research that Handelsblatt and its partners did found that 48% of all these green funds invest in sectors with no ecological added value. So they invested in oil, coal, and aviation, and thus in climate-damaging industries. And I would say this is really a huge problem. I'm thankful for journalists digging deep into that. Of course, it is bad news if you read an article that makes a case for greenwashing, as it undermines investor trust. But on the other hand, I would say it's also good news because it exerts pressure on companies to not make false promises. And for me, this is the bigger problem that the new phenomenon of greenwashing, I have to admit.
If I may add one thing on that, of course, that has to do with the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation and with the definitions that are in there, which are, quite frankly, disconnected from the taxonomy. It's a different disclosure framework. But the Commission is working on improving and making these definitions more detailed, meaning we are working on providing a clear definition of what does it mean doing no significant harm in the context of these Article 9 funds. So far, they should not do significant harm, but it's not clear what that means. So we are working on improving this, and actually the idea of the JRC is that we could reference the taxonomy maybe, but I mean it's really in the middle of the discussion at the moment.
Lucia mentioned a time ago the macro-prudential kind of risk element. Marla, isn't it true that the fossil fuel sector in Canada and the finance industry that is still supporting those investments may run into deep problems if there is no very serious compliance? How do you feel about the kind of the idea that let us say governments have so many problems to come up with stricter, more coherent regulatory efforts? You have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, it's the phrase of 2020, 2021, and now 2022.
I know. Unmute.
That's a really interesting question, Kurt, and there's a lot of different elements that are packed into there. One has to do with the decarbonization efforts of the oil and gas sector, and the other has to do with the role of governments. Which direction should I take this answer, do you think?
Up to you. What do you want to tell us?
One of the things that I'm interested in, particularly in this webinar where we're talking a lot about governments and regulation, has to do with what the appropriate role of governments is with respect to ESG, sustainability and disclosure. That's something that we also have a report that we worked on, and I'll be happy to put a link into the chat shortly. We'd been approached by the Canadian energy regulator about a year and a half ago. They were struggling because as an energy regulator, they are the protectors of elements like water and air and land and a lot of social stewardship, et cetera, when energy development happens, which is obviously aligned with many of the things that green finance and ESG consider. But they weren't quite sure what their role should be with respect to ESG. How does that align with their mandate? How does that align with their responsibilities? How should they be reacting and what should they be doing? Is there a way that they should be bringing in this information into what it is what they look at? We did that project for them and then decided to broaden the question to all of government, because government comprises many different elements. You have policy setting functions, you have regulators, you have those that manage the banking sector, et cetera. And so the question that we looked at is, as ESG investing and as sustainability and green finance come to the fore as important societal drivers, what should be the role of government there and how should they be responding? And in doing our research for this and speaking with a lot of different governments at national, regional, and sub-regional levels, we found that there was a lot of different entities that are struggling with this question. They all wanted to figure out the answer. And there were fundamentally a few different reasons that they were grappling. One is that parallel requirement to take care of the environment, society, and people. That's something that governments themselves are in charge of. And so because that it's walking down the same road as ESG and all those other elements, they wanted to know what to do. A second is because all governments are really concerned about attracting business and attracting investment. And so they wanted to know how their jurisdiction could gain a competitive advantage by being a high performer in terms of ESG in order to draw in that attraction and investment. And a third separate reason is that, like companies, governments are getting credit ratings from the major rating agencies like Fitch and Moody's and all those. And increasingly ESG, the region's own ESG performance was affecting their credit ratings. So this is the why of why they wanted to be understanding this better. There weren't any terribly easy answers, but we were able to parse out the activities into a number of different buckets. The one that we've mostly been talking about today so far has to do with that financial oversight function. That is one of the roles of government. And that's the one where it's really well developed in terms of governments at least understanding what their role is in terms of protecting investors, in terms of setting out rules for the financial industry, in terms of mandatory sustainability disclosure or mandatory GHG emissions disclosure. It's not fixed, but we're well down the road to that. But governments were also struggling with things that were much more fundamental. Most of the governments started at a place saying, maybe we should create our very own framework and apply it to all the companies that are in our jurisdiction and require them to present under this framework, because that way it would be really well geographically aligned. This is a really problematic place for them to start, because in practice, what you're going to get is hundreds and thousands of additional competing frameworks where companies would have to disclose to international standards, but also to all the regions that they were operating in. And that was not a very helpful thing. Some of the conclusions that we came to, some of the low-hanging fruit, is that one of the best roles that governments can take in being helpful here is compiling sustainability and ESG-related information and making it easy for people who want to find it. Governments hold a ton of information. A lot of it is really relevant to those who want to understand sustainable investing, but it's not always easy to find. And so putting it all together, collating that data and putting it forward is something that would help investors, it would help the companies, it would help the governments themselves, and possibly also thinking about setting benchmarks or thresholds or targets for performance for the jurisdiction itself and for the companies operating in it. This would again create a floor that rises for anybody who's operating in that jurisdiction. So that's the direction I thought I'd take that answer, is just that governments are struggling themselves to keep up and to understand what it is that they should be doing, and that they're looking at a lot of different directions, knowing that they're traveling down the same road.
Yeah, thank you. I will take the liberty to take one of the questions in the chat, because this relies a bit on what you just explained. Christina Song makes the argument, there is asking a question to all of you. Given the fact that there may be, let's say, a kind of differences in regulatory approaches, will this lead to offshoring of investments to countries with less stringent taxonomy and standards? Do we know something already about, are there data about it? Or how do you feel about the fact that with this kind of differences in regulatory efforts, approaches, regimes, that there may be this kind of offshoring happening? Any insights, any comment to the question of Christina?
Well, if I may, like from a European perspective, the idea is that you can, for the moment, you can only increase taxonomy alignment if you invest into taxonomy aligned activities. So the focus is on increasing the greenness of investors, and investors badly want to look greener. And the only way they can do that is to invest into activities that are aligned with the taxonomy. So this, of course, is a disincentive towards investing into activities that do no disclosure, that are not aligned, that don't care. So, I mean, in that respect, I'm quite confident that should not be the case.
Okay. Any other kind of comments on this question from Christina?
Maybe there's another competition element regarding this offshoring thing. And I think it much depends on the big markets, right? So if the EU acts firmly, this is already something, because if we look at ESG investment, the EU is actually on the forefront globally when it comes to green bonds by far, but also in other types of products. When it comes to the US, we don't know where they're going. It much depends. It's kind of a political debate, but if they're on board, maybe via the IFRS and the International Sustainability Standard Board, we might get there too. So if we have those two biggest capital markets as of now, that might steer markets further globally. And then much comes down to China as well. So what about the Asian markets and their taxonomies? And I think this will be pretty much the three big regulatory players globally, competing at the same time as trying to inspire each other and finding also the right regulatory framework. So this is my hope, at least, that in the end, this kind of regulatory competition will lead to a best standard optimization and harmonization over the next 5 to 10 years. So hopefully no offshoring issues.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because again, the empirical data, at least provided by Caroline Flimmer in our first webinar, showed us that the China share in green bonds is pretty high. Actually, one of the highest of the three big areas. So whereas the standards there seem not to be as clear as, for example, with the taxonomy. So there seems to be an issue there. So let's see, do we have any more questions in the chat? I was encouraging people, but there was quite a lot of information for your reports and papers you produced in the past, so that's very helpful. Besides the one question from Christina, I can't see a lot of other questions. Is there still something?
I think Sebastian has one.
Yes, Sebastian, please. Yeah, I didn't see it. Sorry for that. Go ahead.
I didn't want to interrupt you.
No, not at all.
Questions from the audience. But I just wanted to add on what Nikolai just said, that it seems as if public initiatives are mainly focused on individual jurisdictions and not at a global level. And what I find interesting is at a global scale, you just find private initiatives that somehow bind their members in a more or less loose way. And so when I look at the public initiatives, I would say, please correct me, I'm happy to hear the views of the others, that often the public initiatives are stricter and in a way greener than private alliances, but they are, as I said, just limited to several or some jurisdictions. And on the other hand, we have these private initiatives at a global scale, but there, I have to say, the experience of all these voluntary self-commitments obviously do not really work. I just remember from this summer the case of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, where major US banks managed to prevent a tightening of the liability attached to their green promises. And I think this example speaks for itself. Investment is labeled green, but in fact is not green, does not help our climate. So I would be curious to get to know what the others think on this public, private, and national and global scale. Thank you.
Any direct comments to Sebastian?
Maybe just very briefly, I think it's somehow a ping pong thing, because when you look at green bonds, for example, you had the Climate Bond Initiative initially starting creating frameworks, and then you had the International Capital Market Association putting out their green bond principles that have been dominating the market ever since, and that in turn has influenced the EU, both the EU taxonomy and the EU green bond standard. And so I think that is something there, it goes back and forth. And of course, it's private standards by themselves will most of the time be more lenient and less strict. But there is also a question and response mechanism that is certainly helpful in finding the regulatory balance.
Yeah, I can add the question from Roy. I can read it. Does Marla or anyone else have any views on Bill 243, the Climate Aligned Finance Act, which aims at mandatory disclosure and enforcement currently before the Canadian Senate? Are you aware of this Bill 243? You are, I guess.
The one that I know of, again, I don't know by its number, assuming it's the same. It's the one that's going to require public financial institutions such as banks, certain insurance plans, et cetera, to have mandatory climate disclosure. And although it doesn't, again, if this is the one that I'm thinking of, it doesn't directly affect or put requirements onto private companies, and public companies, the expectation is that it's going to trickle down to pretty much all of the business world by way of their interactions with those federally funded financial institutions. So it is something that is supposed to be society-wide. It's just getting at it through an indirect mechanism, if I understand correctly.
Thanks so much, Marla. And this also, we're coming to our end of our webinar. If there is anything else you want to contribute, now you have 2 minutes, and then we have to close. I think so. This was a very, Sebastian, please go ahead. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
We only have 2 minutes. Are you sure?
Go ahead. What do you want to say? Something? Your hand was up, a raised hand.
Yeah. Well, happy. I don't want to have the final word, but a more general point, perhaps. But the taxonomy and all the other items that we see for increasing transparency, provide standardization, harmonization. I think this all is very important work. But for me, it is only pre-work. It is just not sufficient. As Lucia said, and also Nikolai, I think the problem we have is that the prices of fossil fuels and also other unsustainable assets, they don't reflect the real costs they cause to the environment. And therefore, we should really think about ways to integrate climate risks of these assets into their price. And Lucia already mentioned it. I think prudential regulation and financial supervision are powerful tools in this regard. But their very purpose is to require financial firms to identify, then measure, and in particular manage risks. And if, at least for me, this is clear, if supervisors come to the conclusion that financial firms, they underestimate their climate risk, then the supervisors should have the possibility to ask firms to either divest or hold additional capital. And as many of you might know, the ECB recently announced action in this regard, and I think we should work to empower supervisors of banks and also insurance companies, pension funds to really get serious in this regard. So transparency is not enough. Good start.
I think so. This is, if I see the face of Lucia and Nikolai, you were saying, yeah, that's a good argument. One more question, and then we are coming around. I read it again. Given the relatively low home bias in EU green bond markets, is there an argument to be made that a climate transition could further integrate EU capital markets? This may be something for Lucia.
Well, I mean, that's a good point. I mean, well taken. Probably yes. I mean, the point is that I mean, for the moment, 1% of the global market is not a super big sample. But if the trend is confirmed, why not?
Quick answer, very good. So we come to the end of our webinar. Thanks so much. This was a fascinating discussion. I think so there's a lot of more to explore, obviously. Thanks for your contributions. Thanks for being with us. And I hope we stay in contact. Thanks so much. And we see each other hopefully soon. Bye now.
Bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.